In the summer of 1944, the United States Navy faced a problem that seemed unsolvable. They had just captured a small island in the Pacific called Tinian. On that island sat a Japanese military airfield. The runway was 4,380 feet long. For Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, perfect. For small fighter planes, plenty of room. But the American military had just introduced a new weapon to the Pacific War, a massive revolutionary aircraft called the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 weighed 65 tons. It carried 12.50 caliber machine guns, one 20mm cannon, and up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. To get that much weight off the ground, you needed runway, a lot of it. Military engineers said they needed at least 8,500 feet of runway minimum, preferably 10,000 feet. The existing runway on Tinian was less than half that. So when commanding officers were told that the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, would have to build those longer runways on a small, largely barren island 1,500 miles from Japan, in a combat zone, under fire, with no heavy equipment nearby, the military brass said it was impossible. But one man looked at that island, at that too small airfield, and saw something different. He saw the future, and he was willing to move heaven and earth, literally, to make it happen. This is the story of how the Seabees built the largest airport in the world, and how, in doing so, they made it possible to bomb Japan into surrender. By the middle of 1944, the United States was advancing across the Pacific. Island by island, battle by battle, American forces were getting closer to Japan. But there was a crucial problem: distance. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber in the world. It could fly higher than any enemy fighter. It could carry more bombs than any aircraft ever built. It had pressurized cabins for the crew, sophisticated aiming systems, and defensive armament that made it nearly unstoppable. But it had one major weakness: range. From the American bases in China, where the first B-29s had been deployed, the distance to Tokyo was over 2,000 miles, round trip. That's a 14-hour mission. The B-29 could barely make it. Supplies had to be flown over the Himalayas, an insane logistical nightmare. Fuel consumption was enormous. And the raids from China, though they reached Tokyo, did far less damage than anyone hoped. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the air campaign, realized something had to change. LeMay proposed a solution: move the B-29s to the Pacific, specifically to a chain of islands called the Marianas, Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. These islands sat only 1,500 miles from Japan. From the Marianas, a B-29 could reach Tokyo, drop its bomb load, and return. The round trip was just 12 hours instead of 14. More importantly, supplies could be delivered by ship. The island chain sat on a direct supply line from the United States. It was perfect. But first, the American military had to take the islands from the Japanese. The battle for Saipan was brutal. 3 weeks of fighting. 24,000 Japanese soldiers died. 3,000 Americans died. But by July 9th, Saipan was secure. Next came Tinian. On July 24, 1944, American Marines stormed ashore on Tinian. The island was small, smaller than Manhattan. The Japanese defenders were few. maybe a few thousand soldiers. The battle was fierce but brief. Within a week, Tinian was officially secured. When the Americans arrived, they found 3 Japanese airfields already built on the island. This was good. They wouldn't have to start from scratch, but it was also a problem. The largest Japanese airfield, called Ushi Point Airfield, had a runway 4,380 feet long. That was long enough for Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. It was long enough for Japanese fighters. But a fully loaded B-29, that runway was far too short. Military engineers did the math. A B-29 needed at least 8,500 feet of runway, minimum, to take off safely. The best-case scenario was 10,000 feet. The runway on Tinian was less than half that. When Army planners looked at the situation, they said it was impossible. You couldn't build new runways on a small island. There wasn't enough space. The terrain was too rough, the island had no equipment, no facilities, nothing. You'd have to bring everything from the States. And there was one more problem. The island was under constant threat of Japanese attack. Nearby islands still held Japanese forces. The airbase on Iwo Jima, just 660 miles away, was a Japanese stronghold. Enemy aircraft could attack at any moment. The Seabees would be working in a combat zone. Building an airport is hard enough in a stable, developed country with modern equipment. Building one on a jungle island under fire, from scratch, with no pre-existing infrastructure? Everyone said it was insane. Everyone except the man in charge. His name was Captain Paul J. Halloran, and he commanded the 6th Naval Construction Brigade. He had one order from his superiors: make Tinian into a B-29 airbase, no matter what it takes. Halloran looked at the island. He looked at the resources available. He looked at his men, thousands of Navy construction workers, heavily armed and heavily motivated. And he said, "We can do this." When the Seabees arrived on Tinian on July 24th, the fighting was still ongoing. Japanese soldiers were still scattered across the island. The southern end of the island was controlled by Japanese forces. It wasn't safe to work, but Halloran had a deadline. The B-29s were already being staged in the Pacific. The first ones were arriving in the region in the next few months. If Tinian wasn't ready, they'd have to stage somewhere else. The entire bombing campaign against Japan would be delayed. Halloran called a meeting with his senior engineers. He laid out the situation. They needed to expand the existing runways from 4,380 feet to 8,500 feet. They needed to build additional runways. They needed to build taxiways, hard stands for the aircraft, maintenance facilities, ammunition magazines, fuel storage, administrative buildings, and housing for 40,000 personnel. All of it had to happen on an island barely larger than Manhattan. All of it had to happen while the island was still being secured against Japanese forces. "How long?" someone asked. Halloran thought for a moment. He said, 3 months. The room went silent. 3 months to build the world's largest airfield on an island under fire. It was an insane deadline. Everyone in that room knew it. But the Seabees had a motto: we build, we fight, we work. They were about to prove it. The first thing Halloran's men did was take the existing 4,380-foot runway and extend it. The runway was simple crushed coral over a compacted base. To extend it, they had to dig, grade, and fill enormous amounts of earth. The northern end of Tinian was largely limestone and coral. They had to blast the limestone apart using dynamite. Then they had to move it. 1 million cubic yards of earth and coral were moved during this project. That's equivalent to the volume of 400,000 large trucks, all backed up and dumped. To move that much material, they used everything they had: bulldozers, excavators, trucks, by hand, working around the clock, in the tropical heat, in the rain, under the constant threat of enemy air attack. The Seabees worked for 45 days and nights without stopping. Shifts ran 24 hours a day. When one crew got too tired, another crew replaced them. There was no time to wait, no time to stop. The deadline was absolute. But there was a new challenge. As the Seabees expanded the island's usable area, they realized something. The terrain was uneven. The runway needed to be perfectly level for the B-29s to take off safely, but the island's natural elevation changed from one end to the other. The engineers would have to not just fill in depressed areas, they'd have to level the elevation differences. At one end of the runway, the island descended toward the coastline. To create a level runway, they had to build it up with coral fill, essentially creating a platform above the natural ground level. This created a situation that would later cause problems, but for now it was the only way to create the necessary runway. Captain Halloran made one crucial decision that would affect the entire project. The B-29s would taxi under their own power, not be towed by vehicles. This meant the taxiways couldn't be too steep. Maximum grade was 1.5%. To achieve this on an island with natural elevation changes, they had to move another 500,000 cubic yards of earth. Total earth moving for the project, 2.1 million cubic yards. By August, the extended runway was ready. Then they built a second runway. By September, a third, and eventually a fourth. 4 parallel runways, each 8,500 feet long, oriented east-west, spaced 1,600 feet apart, all running nearly the entire length of Tinian's northern end. Along with the runways came the infrastructure: 11 miles of taxiways, 265 hard stands, that's 265 parking spaces for B-29s, each one custom designed so the aircraft's ground crew could set up quarters nearby and store spare parts. Hundreds of buildings, ammunition magazines buried underground, fuel storage tanks, a control tower, medical facilities, food service, housing for 40,000 people. All of it built by men working in jungle heat, in rain, on an island that until weeks before had been an active combat zone. And Halloran's men finished ahead of schedule. The main construction was complete by May 5, 1945. The final runway had just been finished. All 4 parallel runways, all the taxiways, all the hard stands, all the support facilities, done. Tinian's North Field became the largest airport in the world. But there was one more thing nobody expected. The 4 runways on Tinian's North Field ran east to west across the northern part of the island. At each end, at the eastern end near the water, and at the western end, the island's elevation dropped sharply toward cliffs. The Seabees had built up the runways with coral fill. At the western end, where the runway terminated, there was a 50-foot coral cliff. It was a dramatic edge. The runway literally ended, and then there was empty space, and then the ocean far below. This created a problem that nobody fully appreciated until operations actually began. A fully loaded B-29 weighed 65 tons. When fully armed and fueled for a mission to Japan, it could weigh even more.
To get 65 tons off the ground from a standstill requires a tremendous amount of runway. The B-29's engines had to accelerate the aircraft gradually. The pilot had to manage throttle carefully. The aircraft had to reach a critical speed called stall speed, roughly 140 miles per hour, before it could become airborne. If a B-29 didn't reach stall speed before running out of runway, it would either have to abort the takeoff or crash. And on Tinian, if you didn't get airborne before the end of the runway, you didn't just plow into a wall. You flew off a 50-foot coral cliff. To manage this danger, the Seabees positioned a marker, a stake, along each runway. It was positioned at precisely the point where a B-29 needed to be traveling at 100 miles per hour with all engines performing perfectly to safely stop if the takeoff was aborted. The stake was the go, no-go point. If a pilot reached the stake at less than 100 miles per hour, he had enough runway to stop safely. If he was still below 100 miles per hour at the stake, he had to abort the takeoff. If he continued past the stake and failed to get airborne, he'd go off the cliff.
The pilots understood the danger. Some of them were visibly shaken by it. Takeoff from Tinian in a B-29 became one of the most stressful moments of any mission. You're sitting in the cockpit of a 65-ton aircraft overloaded with bombs and fuel. You're lined up on the runway. You push the throttles to maximum. The plane accelerates slowly. These were the days before jet engines, and the B-29's piston engines took time to spin up. The runway is disappearing beneath you. Your co-pilot is calling out your speed, 100 miles per hour, 110, 120. The stakes are getting closer. You push harder on the throttles. The engines are screaming. The runway is almost gone. And then your nose wheel leaves the ground. The plane lifts. You're airborne. You clear the cliff. But sometimes pilots didn't clear the cliff. The official records note that some B-29s aborted too late or failed to lift on roll and slid down the abrasive coral cliff, igniting their fuel tanks and often their ordnance. In simpler terms, some B-29s crashed off the end of the runway and exploded. The crews died. It was a terrible design flaw and an otherwise brilliant construction achievement. Halloran and his men had been tasked with building 8,500-foot runways, and they had. But the island's geography, those 50-foot cliffs at the end, meant that every takeoff was a calculated risk. Every pilot knew that if his engines failed, if he miscalculated, if his aircraft was even slightly heavier than expected, he might end up falling off a cliff. But despite the danger, the B-29s kept coming. The first B-29 arrived at Saipan's Isley Fields on October 12, 1944, but Tinian's North Field wasn't quite ready yet, so those early bombers staged from Saipan or other islands. By December 1944, the first B-29s started arriving at Tinian's North Field. The first was the 9th Bombardment Group, arriving on December 28th. More groups followed. By January 1945, there were B-29s parked on all 4 runways. By spring, there were hundreds of them. The island transformed into something that looked like a floating aircraft carrier. Philip Morrison, a physicist who went to Tinian to help assemble the atomic bombs, wrote about his first impression of the island. At its peak, North Field had 265 hard stands for B-29s, but there were even more aircraft parked in every available space. Some estimates suggest as many as 400 to 500 B-29s were based on the island at various times. 400 B-29s on one island, 40,000 personnel to support them, supply ships arriving constantly from the United States. The logistics were staggering. Each of the 4 bomb groups had a specific runway assigned to them. The 6th bomb group used runway D, the southmost runway. They parked their aircraft on the south side of the runway with their maintenance facilities nearby. The 9th bomb group used runway C. The 504th bomb group used runway B. The 505th bomb group used runway A, the northernmost runway. And then there was the 509th composite group. The 509th was different. It was smaller than the other groups, only about 15 aircraft, but those aircraft carried something special. The 509th's mission was classified top secret. Even most people on the island didn't know what they were doing. Their aircraft were specially modified B-29s. Their crews trained differently. They practiced drop sequences that made no sense to anyone watching. They'd fly to a test range and drop a single bomb, then return. Why would you drop just one bomb on a whole mission? The answer was classified. Nobody knew. Not yet. What people did notice was that the 509th had 2 special structures built near runway A, atomic bomb loading pits, hydraulic pits specially constructed, capable of holding something very heavy. Those loading pits were covered with guards. Nobody was allowed near them. Most of the island's personnel had no idea what those pits were for, but some of the senior officers suspected. Rumors circulated. Something big was coming. Meanwhile, the conventional bombing campaign was already underway. Starting in November 1944, B-29s from the Marianas began bombing Japanese targets. The first raids were at high altitude. The B-29s climbed to 30,000 feet, out of range of most anti-aircraft guns, and dropped their bombs from that altitude. The results were disappointing. High-altitude bombing was supposed to be precision bombing, but the B-29s couldn't hit anything with accuracy from 30,000 feet. Winds at altitude pushed the aircraft off course. The bombing was scattered and ineffective. Japan was being bombed, but not devastated. That changed in March 1945. General Curtis LeMay, who had taken over command of the bombing operations, made a radical decision. Forget precision bombing. Instead, the B-29s would attack Japanese cities at low altitude, at night, dropping incendiary bombs, firebombs, on densely populated areas. It was a moral choice that would haunt the war effort. It was also devastatingly effective. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 334 B-29s took off from Tinian and the other Mariana airfields. They flew to Tokyo at night at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. They dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on the city. Tokyo burned. 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. Over 250,000 buildings burned. Approximately 100,000 people died in a single night. It was the most destructive air raid in human history, and it had just begun. Over the next few weeks and months, the B-29s from Tinian and the other Mariana bases conducted raid after raid. They bombed Tokyo again. They bombed Nagoya, Osaka, Kawasaki, Kobe, Yokohama. They firebombed smaller cities. They dropped naval mines in Japanese harbors as part of Operation Starvation, an effort to blockade Japan's home islands by air. The 313th Bombardment Wing, which was based at North Field on Tinian, flew thousands of sorties, thousands of tons of bombs. By the end of the war, the B-29s from the Mariana Islands accounted for 91% of all bombs dropped on Japan and 96% of all bomb tonnage in the war's final 5 months. Those B-29s operating from that tiny island in the Pacific, the island with the too short airfield, were winning the war. Every day, B-29s were taking off from Tinian's North Field. Some days there would be 50 or 100 takeoffs. The runways were constantly busy. Aircraft were being fueled, bombed up, and sent on their way. Other aircraft were returning from missions, landing carefully to avoid accidents, taxiing to their hard stands for maintenance. It was an incredible feat of logistics and determination. But the conventional bombing was building towards something else. By August 1945, the 509th Composite Group had completed its preparations. The war was clearly winding down. Japan was devastated. The military was falling apart. Surrender was inevitable. But before Japan could surrender, something was going to happen that would change everything. In the pre-dawn darkness on August 5th, a B-29 was carefully backed over one of the special loading pits near runway A. The pit contained a weapon that had never been used before, a weapon that wouldn't even be accurately tested before it was used in combat, a nuclear bomb. The aircraft was called the Enola Gay. It was piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets. Its target was Hiroshima. Its payload was a bomb called Little Boy, a uranium-based nuclear weapon with the explosive power of 15,000 tons of TNT. As the sun rose on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay and its escort aircraft took off from runway A at North Field Tinian. The pilot pushed the throttles forward. The 65-ton aircraft accelerated down the runway. The crew held their breath. The runway was there. The cliff at the end was coming. But this flight was different from all the others. The Enola Gay lifted off. It climbed toward altitude. It headed northwest toward Japan. It was a 12-hour round-trip flight. 6 hours to get there, 6 hours to get back. At 8:15 a.m. Hiroshima time on August 6, 1945, the bomb was dropped. 70,000 people died instantly. By the end of the year, from radiation and injuries, the total would reach 140,000. 3 days later, another B-29, the Bockscar, took off from the same runway at North Field Tinian. This one carried a different bomb, called Fat Man, a plutonium-based weapon. Its target was Nagasaki. By August 15th, Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The Pacific War was over. The deadliest war in human history was over. And it had been won, in part, by B-29s flying from an airfield that was supposed to be too short to operate bombers, an airfield that had been impossible to build, an airfield that Halloran and his Seabees had somehow managed to construct on a small Pacific island in 45 days, while under fire and facing impossible odds.
Today, Tinian is largely abandoned. The 40,000 personnel are gone, the aircraft are gone, the runways remain, overgrown with jungle vegetation, crumbling back into the earth. But the scale of what was built is still visible from the air. In 2023 and 2024, the United States military began the process of restoring North Field, not for World War II operations, but for potential future conflicts. In an era of tension with China, military strategists realized that North Field, with its 4 long runways and island location, could serve as a crucial dispersal base for American aircraft. $45 million has been spent to restore the runways, clear the jungle, and return North Field to operational status. The Seabees work from 1944 to 1945 is being brought back to life 80 years later. Captain Paul J. Halloran, the man who said "we can do this" when everyone else said it was impossible, died in 1998. He never received a major medal for his work. He's largely forgotten by history. Most people will never know his name. But his legacy is written in crushed coral, in 4 parallel runways stretching across a Pacific island, in the 400 B-29s that flew from his impossible airfield and helped end the deadliest war in human history. When it was completed, North Field was the largest airport in the world. It has never been surpassed in scale. No airport, before or since, has been built larger. And it was built by men who had been told it was impossible.
Built on an island that was too small, with resources that were too limited, on a timeline that was too tight, under fire from an enemy that was still fighting, on terrain that was too rough. It was built because one man believed it could be done, and because thousands of men were willing to work 45 days and nights without stopping to make it happen. There's an old engineering saying, "Given enough time, enough money, and enough determination, you can build anything." But on Tinian, they didn't have much time. They didn't have unlimited money. What they had was determination, and what they built changed the course of a war. The B-29s from Tinian helped defeat Japan. The atomic bombs dropped from Tinian ended the Pacific War and demonstrated to the world that the nuclear age had begun. The airfield that was too short became the launching point for the future. All because one man looked at an impossible problem and said, "We can do this." Sometimes that's all it takes.